Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the College of Engineering Faculty Lecture Series. The 2024 College of Engineering Faculty Lecture Series features lectures by faculty members leading groundbreaking clean water research in the areas of water recycling, desalination, mineral extraction, water quality management, and more. Today's lecture is titled, How Do People Respond to Visualization of Uncertainty when Involved in Conservation Planning for Climate-Resilient Watersheds? The lecture will be presented by Dr. Meghna Babbar-Sebens, Evans Family Professor in the School of Civil and Construction Engineering. My name is Leslie Rojas, and I am a student in the College of Engineering, and I will be today's event moderator. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the lecture using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. A recording of the lecture with captions will be provided to all audience members even after the event. If you need assistance at any point during today's event, please put it in the private chat to the host and moderators. With that, it's now my pleasure to turn things to Dr. Jack Eistock, who will introduce Professor Babbar-Sebens.
I'm pleased to introduce today's faculty speaker, Dr. Meghna Babbar-Sebens. Meghna is the Evans Family Professor of Water Resources Engineering in the School of Civil and Construction Engineering. She's also the co-director of the OSU Benton County Green Stormwater Infrastructure Facility, which is an Oregon BEST lab. Her research focuses on water resources and environmental systems analysis. She conducts interdisciplinary research for sustainable planning and management of water-based systems. Meghna, thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Leslie and Jack, for that introduction. So in today's lecture, I will be talking about conservation practices. And so what are conservation practices? So these are great natural and nature-based strategies for helping improve the climate resilience of our watersheds where we all live and work in. But planning for these watersheds and these conservation practices at the watershed scale can be extremely challenging and a very difficult engineering design problem itself. And when you think about planning conservation practices, you also have to think about people who live in this watershed and on this landscape. So the role of humans on the landscape can play a really vital role in the design of these plans. So in today's lecture, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about our research in trying to improve how we do engineering design of these conservation practices, using a wide range of strategies by actually including the humans, and what issues do you actually run into. So the outline for this lecture today is, first, I'll talk a little bit about watersheds and what they are, so that for any audience who's not aware or familiar with this term, and also about how they are really important for our communities as a first defense for climate change impacts. Then I'll talk a little bit about what are conservation practices and how they improve climate resilience, as well as why is the problem so difficult and how it's riddled with a wide range of uncertainties. And then we'll get down into the topic a little bit more on the research that we've been doing, trying to look at how people, when you include them in the design process, will respond to how you visualize uncertainty because of climate change, and then how that uncertainty and their visualization and their understanding of the information we show them can actually influence the conservation planning process itself. Okay, so a little bit of background on watersheds. So watersheds we all live in watersheds. It's the land around us. It consists of plants, landscapes, soil, streams, people, animals, birds, everybody. And in watersheds, nature has provided us this wonderful, for free of cost, an ability for these watersheds to provide something called as ecosystem services. What that means is that all the natural features you see around yourself have this capability to do a wide range of things for us. For example, when it floods, they can keep the water stored in the watershed and then prevent overflooding of areas. Then some of the natural features can also help us clean the water by filtering out contaminants or removing contaminants from our streams. And of course, watersheds also provide habitat for a wide range of ecological communities and species. And of course, we do a lot of work in the watersheds, so we get a lot of economic development and make a living. So all in all, it is important for these ecosystem services to be functioning well so that our own health is good as well as our well-being is good. But over time, as we've done a lot of activities where we live, things like deforestation, agriculture drainage, and even urbanization, a lot of these watersheds have become degraded. They have lost their ability to provide those vital ecosystem services. And because of that, what's happening now is we are having a lot more problems with issues related to flooding and droughts, or things like when contaminants are not being able, when the watershed itself is not able to clean up the contaminants, we end up with unhealthy water qualities in our rivers and streams, as well as in our water supplies. So all in all, because of this loss of ecosystem services, it leads to unhealthy people and unhealthy ecological communities. And as the climate is changing, these effects are only getting worse. So a lot of projections from the climate scientists tell us that there are many regions across the world that are going to see lots of different kinds of extreme events. So say, for example, flooding. So a lot of areas will get a lot more flooding now in the future than they used to get in the past. And as the flooding happens, so think about, I'm just taking flooding as an example, but as the flooding frequency and the magnitude of flooding increases in these different places where people live, it'll also lead to water quality problems. So think about it like this: when the water floods in a river, it goes over the landscape, carries a lot of different kinds of contaminants. Those contaminants travel downstream into our water supplies. So water supplies get contaminated, and that all leads to one ripple effect after the other, which affects the well-being as well as the human health. So managing these issues is really important. So how do we help our watersheds improve their ecosystem services? So in the past, there have been a lot of different types of civil engineering infrastructure solutions that we have built and used and implemented all across the world. Things like reservoirs and canals and sewer pipes, all kinds of strategies. And the main idea here was that to be able to store water or move it to a certain treatment plant, clean it, and then release into a river. So a lot of this infrastructure solutions involve a lot of built environment, involve a lot of money, a lot of communities had to argue about what to do, what not to do. However, an important thing to notice is that this infrastructure that we currently live in and around was built based on historical climates. So as the climate changes in the future, many of these infrastructure solutions have lost their capacity to deal with more frequent floods or larger magnitude floods or other kinds of climate change impacts that you may see in the future. So since early 2000s and earlier also, there's been a lot of discussion about how do we go back to renaturalizing our watersheds and making them more climate resilient. And the main idea behind this was, are there ways we can try to bring back some of those natural features that work really well in the watershed that used to exist before, but we kind of removed them? So things like, for example, putting wetlands in agriculture areas or strip cropping and riparian buffers along your stream. And in the urban areas, these could be things like green roofs and rain gardens. But the main idea here is you have plants and soils and topographic features and other natural features that all kind of come together to help provide that ecosystem service that watersheds used to provide originally. But the issue with this is that when you design these systems, you have to sort of figure out places in the watershed where they will work the best. So that you have to somehow come up with solutions that are distributed across the landscape and then sort of work together in providing the benefit that you expect to get from these natural features. So as you can see, this is a very complicated and computationally challenging design problem for engineers. So what I'm showing you here on this slide is a watershed, and all the blue polygons you see are actually about more than 2,900 potential wetland sites that we had identified in a previous research. And the main goal was that historically wetlands would have existed on this landscape, but now they have mostly been drained because of agriculture. So now if I want to go back and put these wetlands on the landscape, I really need to work with the community, right? Because not all of these wetlands will be accepted. Plus, not all wetlands are as effective as some other wetlands may be. So you really need to do a cost-benefit analysis. So what you end up with here is you end up with an issue where there are multiple criteria and goals. There are multiple decision makers you have to work with. And the decision space is huge, 2,900, more than 2,900 potential sites you could choose from. And of course, because we have a limited understanding of the world, there are lots of sources of uncertainty too. And like I said earlier, because humans live on the landscape, you have to work with them and engage them in this planning process, because what choices you come up with well, those acceptable choices will really depend on their own stakeholder conditions and their own preferences or their interest or things like their values, for example. So this cannot be just a computational design problem. This has to have humans in the design process. Now, dealing with the computational challenge of solving this problem, there has been a lot of research in the community about trying to use strategies like simulation optimization and wide range of optimization algorithms people have explored. And the main idea here is these algorithms and these methods are really helpful in quickly looking at some potential design options, then try to find better design options by rapidly searching through the design space. The way it works is, say, for example, each of these circles represent a specific conservation plan. It's a unique plan that has a unique distribution of, say, for example, wetlands on a landscape or in the watershed, like in the example I showed you earlier in the slides. Now, what these algorithms will do is they will take some of these initial potential plans and then they will evaluate them based on some criteria, which could be simulated using some, say, simulation model like a watershed model or a contaminant freight and transport model. Once you evaluate each plan, that plan will give you some information about, say, for example, how cost-effective that plan is. So you say, for example, if you have two objectives, find a wetland plan that is cheaper, so minimize cost, let's say in the x-axis here, and then also a plan that really reduces water quality problems or water pollution downstream. So that will be, say, objective 2 in the y-axis. And the main goal is to find plans that can quickly optimize both the objectives. And many times in practice, when you have multiple objectives, you end up with trade-offs like these, like the ones that you see of this circle, these plans that lie on the red curve. So the goal of these algorithms is to quickly evaluate the plans and use a quantitative or quantified information about their objectives and constraints to generate these Pareto optimal alternatives. And then as an engineer, we say, great, we found, say, about, say, 7 plans that are great, better than all the other ones. Let's show them to the community and hopefully they'll pick one of them. Good luck, because many times when you show them to the community, they don't like any of those plans. They'll say, sorry, none of these plans are going to work for us because we have all these other issues that you did not take into consideration when you were designing our solutions. And many of the issues may be subjective, many of them may be personal, many of them may have other changing, criteria. And so typically, they may be actually more willing to go with slightly suboptimal solutions that are mathematically slightly suboptimal, but more optimal from their perspective of acceptance. So we call this the region of desirable solutions. And so a lot of the work that we do is trying to figure out how do we really improve the ability to do engineering design, where we can use these kinds of algorithms and strategies to find the solutions in the region of desirable solutions. So like I said earlier, the design process really now needs to include both the physical world and your humans into the design process, right? But when you try to do the both, there's an explosion of uncertainties. We anyways have limited data about our physical world. We have anyways limited understanding about our physical world. So there's uncertainty coming from there. Plus, we don't fully understand how our humans behave and respond to different scenarios of conservation plans. So there's uncertainty even coming from there in terms of how each individual may respond. Because remember, many of these plans will go on individual landscape or individual farms or individual backyards and neighborhoods, right? So in our research, what we want to first do is to sort of start exploring this question. Okay, if we do include humans in the engineering design process, does it even work? Do these algorithms help us find those regions of desirable solutions? And what would they look like if I had multiple humans trying to solve this problem, right? So in the experiments I'm going to show you next, the question here we were asking was, imagine a world which is certain. So there is no uncertainty in the physical world. And if I tell you, put a wetland here, the response you will get from the world is exactly what it's going to be, and it's never going to change, right? So we cannot fully understand our physical world, but we don't understand our humans. So what will happen then when we include the humans in that kind of a design process? So to do those experiments and that research, we actually created a decision support system called RESTOR, which is a human-computer collaborative design. And the main approach behind this platform was to sort of include the humans in the design loop. So essentially, we use something called interactive optimization. These algorithms, what they do is they take the evaluation of the design, the numerical evaluation, which could come from, like I said earlier, a watershed model or an economic cost function, for example, and then shows those designs, a few or more, depending on the strategy, to the actual decision maker or the humans who live in the environment. And then those humans will give subjective evaluation about how suitable they find a specific design. Then these algorithms take that information also into account to then go through some iterative process of design with the human in the loop to find out what the region of desirable solutions could be for that problem. And so our goal was to figure out what happens when we do this. Can we find what the region of desirable solutions look like, and how similar or dissimilar it is when different people are involved in this process. So to do this research, what I'm going to show you is some earlier studies where we were looking at a watershed in central Indiana. And we were looking at planning and designing conservation practices that consist of cover crops and filter strips across this landscape. So there were about 108 different subbasins within this watershed where we could put these conservation practices. And to simulate the impact of these conservation practices on the environmental goals that the community had, we used a model called a soil and water assessment tool. It's essentially a watershed model that can help you understand if you put these practices, how much flooding will you get? If you put these practices, what will happen to sediment transport, and what will happen to nutrients, water quality, things like that. So wide range of things you can do. You can ask questions and solve for them using this watershed model. So to do the human-machine collaboration experiments, what we did was in this work, we took, say, 20 folks. Some of them were surrogates, some of them were stakeholders. What I mean by surrogates is that are like test users, say students, for example, who have knowledge about watersheds, who know how they work, and we are engaging them in this experiment. But they don't necessarily live on the land or don't necessarily have that personal connection. And stakeholders were folks who actually live on the land and have a personal connection, or they could be agency folks who, like USDA and RCS folks who work in the landscape and work with the farmers and really understand the landscape. And for these folks, we would show them different alternate plans of cover crops and riparian buffers that the algorithm was coming up with. And then for each of them, we would show a wide range of cost-benefit functions that were quantified that really represented the community's planning goals, things like cost, how much peak flow reduction I'm going to get in terms of flooding. So peak flow basically reduction, when I talk about that, I'm basically saying how much reduction in flooding would I get if I put this plan and then again, some water quality goals they had in terms of nitrate reduction and sediment reduction. So those kinds of simple bar graphs, we would show them and ask them, hey, if this plan is implemented, what do you think about this plan when it comes to the cost or the sediment reduction and things like that? Now, many of these goals were quantified using the SWOT model, like I told you guys earlier. But we also asked folks to subjectively evaluate each of these plans that were being proposed and think about where they live and whether they would think that the decisions being proposed are suitable and acceptable to them. So there were some participants who were looking at the entire watershed, and then there were some participants who were looking at only smaller regions of the watershed, for example, like the pink region or the yellow region that you see in this figure over here or in the map over here. And then we would say, if you're living in a small region like the pink region, just focus on your region and look at how things are working out. Does the plan work for you? Does the plan work for where you live, right? And then very simple rating. We just ask them, just rate and tell us, do you like it? Or you're neutral towards this plan, or you don't like this plan? So what I'm going to show you today are just a few results, just of interest, just to get the conversation going here. When we did these experiments, we took the results and the data that was that we obtained from those experiments, and then we tried to find out, are there solutions that the participants have found that they like or are in the region of desirable solutions? So what you see here in this graph is basically on the x-axis is cost. So lower the value, better it is. And the y-axis is peak flow reduction. So I'm just looking at the two objectives here, cost and peak flow reduction. So a higher value of peak flow reduction is a good thing. And this is participant one who was looking at the entire watershed. So they were interested in looking at the entire watershed scale benefits. If you don't include the human in the design process, and if you just gave this problem to an algorithm, like an optimization technique to figure out and find the trade-off, that algorithm would find all the solutions that are, you see, black colored outlines. Those are solutions that the non-interactive or just the algorithm without any human would find for you. That's the trade-off. But when you included the user in the loop, or the human in the loop, this participant in the loop, you found a bunch of solutions that are colored green, which tell you that there are many more solutions that this participant actually likes beyond the one that the algorithm found without any feedback from this participant, right? And the second thing you notice is that the solution that this user likes is actually lie in a slightly different region than the solution that the user doesn't like, which are the red solutions that you see over here. So clearly this participant is finding a region of desirable solutions, which are the green solutions that are distinct from the region of undesirable solutions, okay? Now, if you do the same thing with participant 6, who was looking at a narrow region, you notice that their region of desirable solution actually overlaps the region of undesirable solutions. So if I just look at the planning goals, you cannot make out why participant 6 would pick one solution versus the other if their cost and benefit is so similar, right? You actually have to get to the design to say, oh, this participant really prefers this practice being proposed for their landscape, and that's why they're picking up this specific practice and liking this solution more than some other solution, even though those plans work very similar in terms of cost and benefits for the watershed. The other thing you can do with this is that once you collect this kind of information from all your community users, and you can then overlay all the actual decisions for conservation practices being proposed in these plans for all the participants to find areas where people actually like certain practice being proposed as a community. So say, for example, what you're seeing here are all the blue polygons you see in the first map here and the third map here are places where, on average, most of the people like putting either cover crops or wider filter strips in their subbasins. But the red are the areas where they don't want to put cover crops. So you can start seeing where the places where certain practice is more preferred versus another location where the practice is not preferred. And then you can also start analyzing the variability in their feedback to understand, oh, if there's more variability across the parts in the feedback, then where are the places where disagreements may happen more? So all the red polygons you see here are regions, for example, where folks say, okay, even on the average, as a community, we think cover crops should go here, but there's a lot of disagreement among people in this community about whether we should really put a practice there or not. So some people, on average, people are saying, yes, put it, but there are folks who say, no, I don't want to see a cover crop there. So that kind of information you can start then gathering through this process to really understand what is an acceptable solution for this specific community. Okay, so that sort of kind of closes the loop a little bit on my discussion about what would they do if I had to include them in the design process in a certain world. But what we really want to focus more on in our work is trying to think about if you are going to use conservation practices to help our watersheds be more climate resilient, we need ways to engage the communities in the design process where uncertainty is also handled and used and understood by people so they can use that information about uncertainty in the future when they're making choices. So the next part of the presentation I'm going to talk about is if there's an uncertain physical world, then what would humans choose? Would they choose one practice versus another, or would their choices be the same? We don't know that. But an issue you run into when you are thinking about this question is that how you communicate that uncertainty to your community is very important, right? There are many challenges when you're trying to communicate uncertainty to the physical world to your humans because people come from diverse backgrounds. They don't necessarily think about uncertainty the same way as maybe you or I or someone else may do, right? And many times when we visualize uncertainty in a digital environment, for example, or a digital platform, or on a computer, or on an iPhone, or another app, people don't necessarily always understand the visualization correctly. And many times they may misinterpret or even ignore the information on uncertainty when you're trying to communicate or convey that information to them. But still, many researchers have found that including uncertainty information is really helpful because it can really help improve. Once they understand what that information means, it can really help improve people's decision-making skills and also increase the trust in the models or the data that we are showing to them. But the key thing is that when you are trying to visualize uncertainty for your community or people in general, you need to think about simple approaches. So well-crafted approaches that can get their attention, minimize the strain on their working memory, as well as strategies that they're more already familiar with in their daily lives, right? With simple formats is much better. So what we wanted to do next was we wanted to say, okay, let's do an experiment where we can visualize uncertainty in a very simple manner about these conservation plans and then see how people respond to that visualized uncertainty. So typically what we know so far is that environmental variables, like for example, peak flow reductions or things like nitrate reductions, all these variables that we work with in conservation planning, they typically have very asymmetric distributions, so very skewed distributions. So the uncertainty is very asymmetric. So if I'm trying to convey that information to someone who lives in the watershed, I have to use very simple approaches. And so what we thought about in this experiment was, what if we showed them three things? We showed them, okay, if you put this conservation plan, here is the average peak flow reduction you could get in the future. But the worst case scenario could be this, and the best case scenario for peak flow reduction could be this other value. So just show them three values. So we chose bar graphs because people are now very familiar with these bar graphs with range bars. We use a slightly interval-based approach to communicate that information. So what you see here is 5 different bar graphs with very same average means, but very different range bars. And in these experiments, what we did was we sort of systematically manipulated those range bars. So we use something called as asymmetric uncertainty metric that we developed in this research as a way to systematically find values of those max and min range bars. So we could tell the community, all right, if you say AUM value is 4 or highly positively biased, your max is much higher than what your average expectation might be, whereas your min value is kind of close to max. But if the AUM goes towards negative numbers, what it means is that your worst case scenario is really, really bad, and your best case scenario is pretty close to being the mean. So you can sort of systematically change the AUM value, and that will shift your range bars and tell a different story to your end user who's visualizing that information or who's looking at that information. To do the experiment, what we did first was we generated 20 plans. And as you can see, these plans on the x-axis is peak flow reduction. And what you see on these plans is that 5 of the plans had the highest mean or average peak flow reduction you could expect in the future. And then as you kept going down, the mean one basically represents plans that have the lowest average peak flow reduction you could expect in the future. So the means are slightly changing, but we wanted to also see that, hey, what happens if it's slightly changed? Do people actually respond to this information? Then we overlaid, based on the AUM, these scenarios of range bars that would tell the user what's the best case and the worst case scenarios could be for your maximum and minimum peak reduction you could expect. And then what we did was we sort of generated these scenarios to create a visualization where they could see the same information, but now with uncertainty. And so when we had folks participate in the experiment, we actually had 2 interactive sessions where they first saw information without uncertainty, then they saw information with uncertainty. And to do this experiment, we use our Restore platform where people would come during the experiment, look at the wetland allocations, for example, where they could be placed, how big or small wetlands are. And then we shuffle the plans so they could see the same plans you saw on the previous slide, but now shuffled, so they don't necessarily see like a sorted decline in the mean values, for example. So it was all looked pretty random. And then we asked them to evaluate these plans and then rate them based on a 7-star rating about what they thought about these plans from terrible to excellent performance rating once they saw this information. In the experiments, we had about 24 end users and 53 test users. And again, like I said, end users are the actual stakeholders who work on these kinds of problems day to day. And test users were, again, students in this case who do have a background in hydrology and watersheds, so they were able to at least understand the meaningful information being showed to them. And the reason we chose test users, again, was because many times when we develop these kinds of technological or computational solutions for our communities, we will often test them on certain users who may not necessarily be the folks who will actually end up using the tool. So for development processes, we want to see, all right, if we have end users and test users, do they give similar results or will they be very different from each other? And then this research or this experiment was conducted through the Zoom, so we did virtually because it was like COVID time almost, I think. Okay, so the results I want to first show you here. There's actually a lot going on in these graphs, but I'm just going to focus on 2 things today. So on the left-hand side, the graph that you see are the plans again, but this time I've sorted them out based on the decreasing order of mean. And the right side tells you on the x-axis the average rating the participants gave once you looked at those plans. So the blue circles that you see over here are, if you just show them the mean, just the bar graphs, okay, and you don't show them the range bars, what rating would they give? And you can kind of see, yes, when the mean values are high, people systematically give higher ratings. So the blue dots sort of systematically shift as you go from mean 4 to mean 3 to mean 2 to mean 1, right? But when you start showing them these range bars, you see that the ratings they give are actually different. So, and we found them to be statistically different when we did some testing on them. And the other thing you notice here is that if you show them the information about the best case scenario, they tend to rate the solution higher than when you show them a plan that the way the worst case scenario is really, really bad. So as you can see, as the bias in the AUM goes from, say, 4 to -4, you can see the rating also declining accordingly. So they were picking up that information, they were looking at the range bars and then making a decision based on how they, how much preference they had for a specific plan. The next thing I want to quickly show you guys today here is we also wanted to again ask, do the end users and test users behave similarly when I visualize information like this? And we saw, yes, they do. They both have linear relationships. So when your skewness is sort of positively biased for AUM versus negatively, you see an increase of the ratings, the average ratings of these end users as well as of the test users for each mean value of plans. But what we noticed was that the slope of the lines for the end users was much steeper than the slope of the line of the test users. And what that tells us is the end users are actually more sensitive and more influenced by the uncertainty information and the range bars than the test users are. So when you're just using test users, you want to be careful about how you interpret the results. And then the last thing I want to quickly show you today is about statistical background. So one thing we did ask our participants was that, hey, do you have any training in statistical methods? Have you used it in your work? Things like that. And what you see here, I'm just showing you fitted trend lines. There is no actual raw data here. They're just fitted trend lines of folks who responded yes and folks who responded no. So blue line is data for folks who have had no statistical background, and red are the folks who have had statistical background. And you see that as the range bars go from negatively biased AUM to positively biased AUM, they start giving higher and higher ratings. So they are definitely more sensitive to the information on uncertainty and are more influenced by that than the folks who don't have statistical background. So if you want information to be picked up by your community and your end users, statistical training is definitely important to think about. All right, so in conclusions for today's talk, what I want to point out some messages here is, first is, if you're thinking about figuring out ways to make communities more resilient for future, especially when it comes to managing climate change impacts, conservation planning process should definitely include humans in the design process, because if you just use computational approaches, you will not get solutions that the communities may be willing to adopt and accept. But by including the humans in the design process and coming up with better ways to interact with them and use that information, you can find solutions that the community is more willing to adopt and actually implement. But again, thinking about climate change, uncertainty is a very important factor we have to think about. So what we noticed here was that, again, we're just scratching the surface here, but what we noticed in these experiments was that if you do show them skewness, people do respond rationally to it. So thinking about how should I visualize skewness and what other strategies may be more relevant for a certain community is something we all need to think about as we move forward. And of course, it should be very easy to understand. Otherwise, if you show them really complex information on uncertainty, you may lose your community. And finally, like I said, people who are trained to use statistical data are definitely will show more sensitivity to the information you show them on uncertainty. So training is definitely necessary. So some of the future extensions we want to explore through this work is what happens if I use other kinds of graphical representation approaches, like, for example, if I use generalized line plots or other kinds of plots, will people still understand them fine, and will they be able to actually use them towards conservation planning? What about other kinds of benefits? So I just showed you experiments involving peak flow reduction, but what about other co-benefits that conservation practices provide, like sediment reduction or reduction in the fertilizers and nitrogen in the water streams, things like that. Cost. What if there was uncertainty in that information too, and how would they navigate that? And so definitely want to explore that direction. And then besides the visualization strategy, Are there other user characteristics, for example, like environmental values or their ability to, or their risk preferences, for example, or their numeracy? Are there other characteristics that can also influence how they make choices when they visualize the information? And we do know through research that these things do affect, but how does it actually affect when it comes to the feedback you get from them in a human-in-the-loop design process? Finally, the main goal here is to take a lot of the stuff that we're doing right now to advance these approaches for human-in-the-loop optimization so that these kind of strategies are more adaptive and then also calibrated to a specific community. So when you think about climate change resilience, you have to think about what solutions will work for one community versus another. So they may not be the same. So being able to calibrate to your community is very critical. With that, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators and students without which this work wouldn't have been possible. So this is a big team effort. I'm not the only one who are doing this work. All of us came together, and so I'm really appreciative and grateful for that. And of course, the funding agencies who support this work and our, last but not the least, our partners and stakeholder participants who have worked and participated in many of these experiments over the years. With that, I'll say thank you, and I'm open for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Babbar-Sebens, for sharing your research with us. I truly learned a ton, and coming from my background, just all the computational stuff that you're going through, and I got to learn just a ton of how, again, engineers in the real world interact with humans and with other people and how we take them into account in certain aspects. We will now begin the Q&A portion of our event. And I get to talk about a little bit a personal question of my own. As you continue human collaborative design experiments at a bigger scale rather than those smaller sample groups, what is the way you approach uncertainty and propose new designs to day-to-day communities change at all? Or is it pretty similar as you were doing in those studies and in the forms?
Oh, they will have to be adaptive, definitely, because if I'm showing this to my grandmother versus if I'm showing it to someone else who has some technical experience, same information, may not be digested or understood the same way. So we have to figure out more creative, adaptive ways to visualize the same information that is really personalized for the user with certain characteristics, so that it's optimized for their cognitive ability to understand the information we're showing them. Yeah, so it's not like one solution for everyone. It has to be creative and adaptive to everybody.
The USDA Web Soil Survey seems like a great resource. Is this software easy to use effectively for non-engineers and in the farming community?
So the soil survey platform really gives you a lot of information about the soil types in your landscape. And they have tried many times over the years to improve the interface to make it more accessible. But the good thing is the data is all free, right, for all of us who live in the watershed. So I think with a little bit of training, and if you come to my hydrology class, I train my students to work with that software. But with a little bit of training, I do think that yes, if you're a community member, you can work with that interface easily and get information about where you're living, or if you're trying to do some development project. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, thank you. And happy to please contact me separately if you need any assistance with that software. I'm happy to meet and help out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The next question that we have is, how do you overcome the problem of salinity and high TDS in water efficiently?
So is this related to streams or is it just drinking water? I'm not sure what the question is about in terms of, is it a treatment plant or is it?
How would it be in our drinking water?
So it depends on what strategy you're choosing, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're choosing some, say, nature-based strategies like, for example, wetlands and stuff, they are really good, have these processes with plants and soils and water. They'll actually recycle and take the water and remove some of the dissolved substances. Mm-hmm. So again, it depends on, we try to simulate the same process in a treatment plant by using all kinds of things like reverse osmosis or membrane filtration. There's a wide range of strategies, and environmental engineers do a great job of figuring, how best to do it in a controlled area like a treatment plant. Mm-hmm. So depending on where that water is, and what are you using it for, there are many options available. Yeah.
Okay, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
How have flood controls projects impacted watersheds over the years? Is this something we need to monitor in the future?
That's a great question. And it's going to open up a can of worms. So it depends on who you ask this question, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you say, hey, I am a city of XYZ living right next to a big river and having access to levees and reservoirs are really helpful in minimizing flood impacts in my community. That's a great question. And people say, yes, this is really helpful. These kinds of projects have been really helpful. But if you ask folks who live, say, for example, the tribes, or if you ask folks who live in the landscape and you think about, or the environmentalists, how these projects have affected, choices like the ecosystems around the river, or even things like, for example, communities downstream or upstream who get affected by these projects, they may not have the same answer, right? So yeah, this is a great question. We have done a lot of progress, but I think the way to go in the future is to, when you think about flood control project, to be more cognizant about who all are going to get affected by these projects and how do we make sure that the voices of everyone is taken into consideration so that you can then find more acceptable design. The design or the solution doesn't have to be perfect in terms of the quantitative sense, but it's a solution that can actually work and is adapted to take into consideration how to manage the constraints that you would feel that you may face when working with other communities that get impacted. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's one of the most interesting things that I understood from your lecture and just got to learn more from.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I learned a ton. The next question that we have is, in practical application, many or most watershed interventions have embedded economic interest, who in many cases hire PR firms and influencers. How do you account for that in trying to firm optimum solutions?
Another great question. Thank you for asking the question. Yes, I think this is a struggle about, when you have voices that are dominant voices and non-dominant voices in a community that are trying to figure out how to manipulate a decision that's made for a community, right? And that's a really important problem that a lot of my social scientist colleagues actually try to deal into. In this case, what we're really trying to move towards is, we know that creating democratic solution is not an easy problem, and there will always be folks who will influence the process and try to figure out a way to, push for a certain solution. But are there ways we can improve that process? Are there ways we can make the process more transparent so that everybody has a say and everybody understands the pros and cons of a solution that maybe a loud voice may be trying to, push through the decision-making process, right? So in any case, it's a tricky scenario that I don't think we can fully move away from when you have someone who's hiring a PR firm, for example, to run down and push a certain design or solution. But it's something that the community, you have to work with your community to go through the process of figuring out, is this what they really value? This is what they really want. And if there is a good solution that works for everyone, then why not? Why be against it, right? If it's actually going to solve some of these creative problems or some of these really hard problems.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, and then we have another question.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about factors to consider in a cost-benefit analysis for green stormwater infrastructure?
Yes, sure. I'm more than happy to. So when we think about them as engineers, many of our cost-benefit may be simple things like how much money I'm going to spend, how much, say, flooding benefits I get for a city when I put those green infrastructure in the region, or things like how much, if I have runoff from urban areas, from streets and roadways and other kinds of industrial spaces, are these stormwater infrastructure practices able to help reduce some of the water quality problems downstream as the water goes from these practices into storm drains and into the rivers? Mm-hmm. So those are kind of things that engineers usually think about and are part of the criteria that you can use in the design. But then there are other issues that also come up. And that also should be part of your cost-benefit analysis. Mm-hmm. So, for example, where are you actually implementing these practices and how it affects the community who lives there, right? Are there some issues related to safety, or are there issues related to, land prices that can affect in terms of if a community lives a certain place and you put these green practices, suddenly the place looks great, but does it increase the cost of the land or the housing, right? So there are these social impacts that can also happen when you implement these solutions. And being cognizant of what they are and trying to find ways to include them in the cost-benefit analysis is extremely vital. But again, to find what those are, you have to again work with your community to see what is relevant to this community. Because what's relevant to this one community may not be relevant to a different community who may have other criteria for the green infrastructure that you're putting in and how it affects their personal lives, right? Maybe it's a good thing for them in terms of, say, transportation, but maybe it's a bad thing for them for something else, right?
That is so interesting about how it affects each community differently and even individual. Our next question is, how cost-effective are the storm gardens industry in Corvallis?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer right now in terms of the numbers. I can't give you a quantitative answer, but it's a good question to work with the city on. Like, how effective have they, if we have invested X amount of money in putting these rain gardens and bioretention systems all across Corvallis, how much benefit we are really getting. And that's something, I'm more than happy to talk about those with you if you're interested in exploring that question, or that issue for Corvallis perspective. But people have done those kinds of analyses in other places too, but I don't know if we've done this in Corvallis yet. That's something maybe the city engineer knows more about.
Well, another thing we'll take into consideration.
No worries.
Okay, our final question is, the error bars are brilliant. Do you think about using coefficient of variation?
Yes, one step at a time. So we want to start really simple strategy to communicate the uncertainty. And so we said, what's the most meaningful information that they would care about? But yes, I think with advanced statistical metrics, there's also education that needs to be part of the process of what do you choose in terms of what you want to visualize, right? So I understand many engineers and students may understand what coefficient of variation is, but people out in the public may not necessarily understand. So what will be the process of training them on that before they can actually fully take that information into account in their decision making? So it's like, it's a little bit of step-by-step process of figuring out what makes most sense. But it's great. Yeah, it's a great question and definitely a relevant question. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you again, Professor Babbar-Sebens, for the fascinating lecture and for your answers to all the questions. Before we go, do you have any parting comments to share with the audience?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I think the only thing I like to sort of ask folks to think about how our world is changing, right? We have technology, we have, the other stresses that are existing on our planet. So when you think about the future and we think about the role technology and even things like artificial intelligence plays, are there ways we can make it more responsible? Are there ways we can make it more democratic and transparent? Each of us, even if we are not a computer scientist, each of us play a role in how we can leverage technology to really improve the quality of our planet and the life on this planet in the future. So even though this is a research question we're asking, this is also a personal question we should be asking ourselves, is how I want to use information to make my decisions for our future. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, well, thank you. And thank you all of you in the audience again for joining us today and for your great questions. As a reminder, we will email you a captioned video recording of the lecture. We also hope you'll join us for future College of Engineering faculty lectures. You can find a link to the full schedule of all upcoming lectures on the page for today's event. Thank you again for attending and have a wonderful afternoon.